you could hear that on there, there's a lot of sustaining going on. Notes which just stay as long as I want them to go, and that's what a sustainer gives you. So I can play, you know, any note, and it's just going to sit there and sustain. You know, really low notes may change. You can hit changes into a harmonic. Different notes might react slightly differently. You can also hear that you can do a lot with the note once it's sustaining. And that's the great thing about a sustainer, is it gives you a whole other kind of area of the guitar opens up. If you are thinking about getting a sustainer, there's some things you might find interesting and useful to know about. So I'm going to go over some of those things because they're not for everybody. It sounds like a great idea. It looks fun, and it is fun, but it requires some extra technique to make it work well. And that's what we'll look at. So that's what I'm hoping will be useful, is if you look at like what's really involved in this. It's not just simple a matter of slapping a sustainer on and you're good to go. So let's just start by looking at like how they work. So here's the sustainer pickup, and it's not really a pickup, it's like the reverse of a pickup in a sense. It sends out magnetic field that vibrates the strings, and it's fed by this pickup, which is a normal pickup, this bridge pickup. It's a conventional pickup. It goes through a whole lot of electronics which are in here, and there's like serious electronics powered by a 9-volt battery, and this signal is fed into this and it is turned into an electric field which revibrates the string by exactly the same sound that comes into it, the same frequency that comes into it. So it works a bit like guitar feedback in an amp or an EBow, but it's built into the guitar and it simply works by holding a note down. You can switch it off and on, and there's other control. You can turn the amount, and you can make it go up an octave and so forth by clicking switches. Sometimes it just goes up an octave of its own accord anyway. So that's how it works. So that's one thing to consider. Like, do I want the work in my guitar to be done? Because some routing work had to be done in this guitar to fit the electronics. They don't fit into the cavity of a lot of guitars have for their volume and tone control. I had to route out extra here. Now this guitar is it's been bashed about and, cut up, and anyway, so it didn't matter. I didn't care. And my attitude anyway is, a guitar needs to be functional, and you've got to do what you got to do to make it do what you want it to do. But if you had a really expensive guitar, finely built guitar, you obviously not going to want to do that. This guitar it's a nice guitar, but it's not like finely crafted wood or something like that. So it wasn't a big deal for me to go and do that, but you could get a professional to do it for you if you're worried about that. But again, it might not be right for all guitars because of that. The other thing is how you play it and what's involved with that. So looking at that, the first thing to note is that the strings have more energy in them. Now you just heard that, right? You just heard that note start to feedback. So if I just let go of the strings, they start to vibrate. They'll pick up any vibration, they'll start feedback and vibrate. And if it takes nothing to make it do that. So you've got to keep them damped all the time. A lot like if you had a loud amplifier next to you that was in a position where it was feeding back. You've got to damp your strings the whole time, but a lot more than that. If I play a note like this, it's going to go on for as long as I hold it. If I don't damp all the other strings, they're going to start, sooner or later, they're going to start playing back. So let's see if I can get that to happen. You hear that? Another note started to play. So you've got to keep all the notes damped all the time that you're not playing. So that doesn't suit everybody's playing style. Now, if it's really important to you to have this kind of sustain, you're going to have to develop a way of doing that. And you see what I mean? I had my finger held down on that note, and I didn't even play it. It started to play. So the right hand's got to be there damping the strings, and the left hand. Whatever you need to do. For me, it's a combination of left and right, making sure that all the strings are damped. The other thing to consider is that when you don't have a sustainer, and I'll switch it off here and just play a note, and you can hear it dies away. Some notes will last longer, some less longer. But they're going to die away. And the amount of time that they spend ringing is partly down to where you play on the neck, and partly just, you know, the nature of each guitar is different. But you don't have complete control over that. With a sustainer, so you just kind of get used to the idea that notes end when they end to a large degree, I find. With a sustainer, you have to choose when to end the note, because it's just going to keep going. So if I'm sustaining that note, I've got to decide when am I going to end it. Now, I might just go to another note, or I might have ended on that note and I want to end it at a certain time. And so the ends of the notes become very important. They become a rhythmic quantity, as it were. They become a rhythmic, have a rhythmic meaning to them. So every note you sustain and that you end at some point, you need to end it somewhere in relation to the beat that makes sense musically. And it becomes a part of your playing. And if you don't pay attention to that, it's going to sound a bit off. If you just end notes in a way that seems unintentional and doesn't have some musical value to it. So you've really got to build that into your playing. Every note that you sustain, end it on a beat, or end it on, you know, some part of a beat that makes sense musically with the rest of the music. So that's the other thing you've got to learn to do. The next thing is that ending a note takes some practice. So if you just play a note and then let go of it, you hear that? It's going to vibrate against the fret as I let up on it. That doesn't happen without a sustainer. The note just kind of gracefully ends when you take your finger up. With a sustainer, because there's a lot of energy in the strings, and that's the other thing to consider. It feels different to play. The strings have a lot more energy in them because the sustainer is making them vibrate, and you can feel that. You can feel that energy under your fingers. And that's not for everybody. You might find that off-putting. I found that I got used to it fairly quickly, but you might not. So that's another thing to consider. Is that kind of extra energy in the strings an okay thing for you in how you play? But that aside, when you end that note, if you don't do it right, it's going to make that kind of squeaking kind of noise. So you've got to learn how to end them without creating that. So if I end a note with my right hand, you can hear it makes a noise, doesn't it? Because there's energy in the string and you're stopping that energy. Now that might be fine. You might kind of like that slightly percussive end to the note. But if you want it to be not having that little squeak there, you're going to have to find another way of doing it. So what I do, I kind of move my finger this way. and it sort of damps it without actually hearing it slide to the next note because it doesn't make it that far. That took some practice and some work. So you need to consider that. If you're going to have it on all of the time, you're going to have to learn how to stop the notes in a way that sounds graceful and doesn't, you know, buzz when you let the note go, and doesn't stop dead with a kind of percussive edge if that's not what you're after. So that takes a bit of practice, and it doesn't work the same on all of the notes. You have to do it slightly differently on different strings and so forth, different parts of the neck, because the energy, it feels different. The vibration feels different in different parts of the guitar, and the same exact technique isn't necessarily going to work quite the same way. So this takes some work and some practice to make the playing sound kind of seamless and clean and everything else. And this may not be for you. If you play in a way where you're not able to damp the strings with your right hand because your hand is maybe up off the strings, and that's just how you play, then you might have a problem there. Similarly, if you play in a way where you don't damp much with your left hand because you're playing like maybe like this more, again, you could have a problem in terms of damping. Maybe not, but you know, I play both ways depending what I'm doing, but there are times where I do find it useful to be able to kind of have my fingers flat on the strings to damp things, and that may be a problem for you, it may not be. Really worth considering this though. Now, it'd be great if you could just try a guitar out with a sustainer, wouldn't it? Go to a music shop and try one out, but they're not easy to come by in most places. So unfortunately, you're not going to be able to do that. But I would suggest that you do something like, if you can afford it, even just get a really cheap guitar. If you've got a guitar that you don't care much about, you know, put the sustainer on that one first. And, you know, hack out the wood or whatever and play and see if you like it before you take your prized guitar and have a sustainer put on it. Might be something worth considering. Let's see if I can think of anything else. I think that's it for actually the technique you need to develop to kind of use it. But I think the final thing I'll end on that's, I think, just as important as all the rest of that is to just think about, like, why do I want a sustainer? Because when I thought about it, I just thought, oh, it'd be great if I could sustain notes as long as I want. But I didn't really think about what that meant until I had it. And then I thought, oh, great, I can sustain this note as long as I want it to go. But now what do I do with it? If you just let it sit there, you know, it gets pretty wearing on the ear. Yeah, occasionally just a sustained note doing nothing might fit the music very nicely, but if you're just doing that all the time, it gets a bit like, why is this happening? Why am I hearing this sustained note all the time? So you want to do something with it, like vibrato it. And that means developing your vibrato technique if you haven't already done that. You know, if you haven't really developed your vibrato technique, that's a lot of work. To get a good vibrato technique, you know, it takes as much work, I find, as, like, say, fast picking or something like that, some other obvious technical thing. I find that really good vibrato takes just as much work to get really good as that for most people. So it's worth considering, am I really going to be able to develop my vibrato to that degree? Not everybody plays with much vibrato. But if you've got sustained notes, I think if you're like most people, you're going to find you're going to want the vibrato, because it's kind of, that's what's featured, is what's this note going to do when it's sustaining? Why is it sustaining? Why have I got this? There's a lot more you can do. You know, there's different kinds of vibrato techniques, and you can even stretch the note or lower them by pulling or push towards the bridge, pull up away from the bridge. And that's, again, I think, an important technique if you're using sustainers, because intonation is a whole massive area in itself. Now, if you don't have much sustain in your guitar, or you've got all the treble rolled off of your guitar, it's not as noticeable. Like, I mean, a clean sound with all the treble rolled off. Not a lot of sustain. You don't kind of notice that so much, and it's not so important. When you've got a lot of upper mids in your guitar, which when you start adding distortion, it's exactly what it does. It emphasizes all those upper mid frequencies. They become the kind of dominant part of the sound, which is very much not the case with some clean sounds where, you know, it's much more the kind of lower mids that are the dominant thing, and you don't really hear the upper mids as much, or they're there, but they don't last as long. And what kind of sustains out is the lower mids. The ear is less sensitive to those pitch with those, I find. But those upper mids, once you've got a bit of distortion on the signal, a bit of amp, a bit of overdrive, really brings those upper mids to the forefront. And then the pitch starts being really important, getting it exactly right. You really hear it. And if you've got sustain, it becomes even more important again. There's nothing worse than a sustained note that isn't in the sweet spot. So you've got to, again, you've got to learn to pull your notes in. And that means sometimes flattening them a little bit, or pulling them up a little bit, depending on how it sits with the music. So it isn't a matter of saying, oh, well, I'll just have a tuning meter and I'll make sure I watch that when I'm playing. No, because that may not be the sweet spot exactly in. It might be that a little bit sharper, a little bit flat with the rest of the music and all the kind of tempering that goes on in there, an approximation of tunings of different instruments, that it's just going to sound sweeter, a little bit sharper, a little bit flat. Of course, you know, if it should sound sweeter, a little bit flat, and it's a little bit sharp, it's going to sound really sour. So you've got to feel it out and do it kind of intuitively. But to do that, you really need to have that technique and work a bit on how you do that, how you get that to happen. You can do it with a tremolo arm, or by pulling and pulling towards the bridge, you're pulling back. But the same thing can happen with the tremolo arm. You can pull it down a tiny bit, pull it up a tiny bit. And again, if you're doing vibrato with the tremolo or with your left hand, you know, that also does the same thing because it kind of moves the pitch around. And you get away from that kind of sour, unsweetened note. This starts becoming much more of an issue because the ear of the listener, which is also you, as well as the person listening to the music, starts to hear, okay, that's sour sounding. Whereas if you've got a sound which doesn't have a lot of top end, or the notes die away quickly, you don't really have enough time to hear that. It's approximately there, that's good enough, you hear the note and what it means musically, and great. But if the note's sitting there and sustaining, you know, the ear has time to really immerse itself, you know, bathe itself in that sound. And if it's not sweet sounding, it's going to get noticed. It's going to be noticeable. So yeah, that's the other thing with the sustainer. If you really want it to sound great, you've got to either really get your vibrato technique together, or and I would suggest both, you learn to sweeten the notes. I certainly find playing with a sustainer fantastic, but it did take quite a lot of work to get it to sound right. And it's just worth you noting that if you're going to invest in that and work on your guitar and have work done on your guitar, that you are kind of prepared for what it means. It's not, you know, it may not be for you. But if it is, I hope you really get as much enjoyment out of it as I do. So yeah, I hope you found this useful and interesting. And I'll see you in the next one.